Hello, 7th grade. Today we're going to be starting our second textbook for our life science course. We're going to be going into our Cells and Heredity textbook, and we've been spending so far all of our time in the human biology textbook. But I think that it would make sense for us right now to jump into the Cells and Heredity, and then perhaps later, especially if we go back to school, jump back to the human biology textbook. So far in life science, we've been studying human biology. So we've been talking about different organ systems in your own bodies, how you eat, how you breathe, how you see and sense information, and all of that. But when we talk about cells, this is going to more broadly apply to all living things, whether that's a mushroom or a plant or a person or a flea or what have you. The concept of cells is going to be central to all living things. And this section 1.1 is basically going to be an introduction to cells, an introduction to this smallest unit of life. And then pretty much the rest of this textbook is going to be studying the cell. And you might not think there's all that much interesting in cells, but you'll be amazed at how complex these tiny little things are. So, let's start by talking about life. We kind of did this at the beginning of the year in our start of studying the human body, but I just want to be thinking about life in general now, not just humans. So let's review what some of these characteristics of all living things are. And this is according to your textbook. Different textbooks or different people might put it a little bit differently, but this is according to how your textbook has it laid out. So all living things have some level of organization. I mean, like you look at us and we see a ton of organization. We have all these different types of cells that do different functions and different organ systems. And those organ systems are made of tissues, which are made of cells. And you remember that whole thing back from our very first lesson. So all living things have some form of organization. Now, some things are more organized than others. Like we'll see some simple organisms that are just a single cell, and there's not a whole lot to them, relatively speaking, compared to, say, us or an elephant or whatever. But they are still very highly organized. A second characteristic of life is that they have the ability to develop and grow. So you don't look the same as you did 5 years ago even. You are growing. All living things, from the moment they start living to when they end living, they have this kind of development and growth happening during that time. And all living things will have some sort of growth or development. A third characteristic is the ability to respond to the environment. This kind of ties back to our nervous system, but other living things don't have nervous systems and they respond in different ways. So we live in some sort of environment, or all living things live in some sort of environment, whether that's in a pond or in dirt, in a house, and there's stuff that's happening around us. Living things have the ability to respond to whatever it is that is happening around it. So if you poke a worm, it might start wiggling because it sensed something happening to it and it's trying to respond to better its chance of survival. A fourth characteristic here, let's see if the slideshow brings it up. There it is the ability to reproduce. Living things make more living things. So humans have babies and then there are more humans. If we didn't have babies and then we all died, then humans would be gone. So any living thing that doesn't reproduce ceases to be a type of living thing. Grass reproduces. It actually makes seeds, and you can plant more grass. Bacteria will reproduce. They can split and make more bacteria. All living things are able to reproduce in some fashion. They have to make more of themselves. And sometimes in very interesting and creative ways. Hopefully we can get into a little bit of that sometime. Actually, before we go on, I want you to look at this picture. I have a picture of a bird on a rock, which is in water. And what I want you to do is just kind of an exercise. Think about the characteristics of life here, and then kind of compare and contrast maybe the bird and the rock. Like, we know a rock is not a living thing, and we know that a bird is a living thing, and we can use these 4 points here to kind of think about why that's the case. So, a bird is organized. It has different organs and organ systems and tissues that carry out different functions. And a rock doesn't have that. It's just rock material. And it's true enough, there is some sort of organization to a rock, but not the kind of intentional design of organization that enables it to be a living thing. It's more like it might have certain layers or crystals in there. And it's not the same kind of organization. Rocks do not develop and grow. While it is true that they change over time and that they can turn into other kinds of rocks, there's no natural growth of a rock. It just stays a rock, and if anything, it deteriorates as it gets eroded away. Whereas a bird, it starts out as a cute little chick in an egg, and then it grows into an adult bird. And actually, speaking of eggs, it reproduces as well. The birds lay eggs, which hatch birds, which lay eggs, which hatch more birds, and so on. Also, the bird can respond to the environment, and the rock will not respond to the environment. So if you, say, throw a rock into the water and splash it right next to those other rocks, the bird might fly away, but the rock will not fly away because the rock can't sense it, it can't respond to it, it does nothing, it just is there. The bird will respond to that action, though. Okay, so let's talk about the needs of life. So all living things have several basic needs. And once again, this is a list that can be put in different ways depending on who you talk to, and this is according to your textbook. All living things need energy. We move, and every movement that we make takes up energy. Everything that is done inside your body uses energy. So you need this energy to function. If you don't have energy, you're not going to survive. So if you remember from our digestive system notes, why we eat, one of the reasons is to get energy. So that we can power ourselves, kind of give us some battery power or something like that. We also need materials, and this is the other reason we eat. You need materials to kind of build your body. And all living things will need materials to build their body, whether it's a plant or a germ or whatever. It will need materials so that it can actually exist and have some sort of form. If it doesn't have materials, it can't really exist. And the very nature of life is that it uses up materials, and sometimes things have to get recycled, or there's waste products and such, so you need to kind of keep replenishing those materials as well. And the third need is living space, and sometimes this is described as shelter or whatever, but since we're talking about all living things, we're just going to say living space. So if you see the little foxes down here in the corner, they need a nice little den for their home, and they also need to eat. They often will eat, say, rabbits or other rodents to get their energy and materials. So that's how you can think about all of their three needs being met. We could also think in terms of, say, a plant. So the oak tree in my front yard, it gets its energy from the sun. It actually makes its own food. And it can get materials through its roots. It can suck up lots of nutrients. And its living space is kind of that space it has in the yard. If I tried to grow an oak tree, say inside a plastic bottle, it might sprout, but it wouldn't be able to survive very long because it doesn't have the space required for it to live. And also under the category of living space, there's different types of space. So it's not just like it needs 10 cubic feet and that's its living space. That's part of it. It needs enough room. But it also, in addition to having enough room, needs the right kind of room. So like if you put a fish in a desert, it's not going to live very well, even if you provide it with plenty of energy and materials and space, because it's not the right kind of space. Just like if you were to put us into the middle of outer space or on the moon, we wouldn't have the things that we need there either to survive. It would be too cold for us, for one, and not the right having air. We need air to breathe. So these are the three basic needs of life. Now, all living things, and this is often counted as a characteristic of life from a few slides ago, but because this is going to be the main topic, it's being brought up now. All living things are made of cells. A cell is the basic unit of life. So I don't have that written down here, but you should write that down as a definition. A cell is the basic unit of life, the smallest unit of a living thing. So it's the smallest little thing that we can point to and say, that is alive. If you look at things inside the cell, they're not really alive, they're just parts of the cell, which is a living thing. Now a couple vocabulary terms for you. Unicellular and multicellular. Unicellular organisms are made of one cell. So down here in the corner, bottom left, we have a paramecium, and that is a unicellular organism. Multicellular, as you might guess, are made of multiple cells, like this picture of a tissue here. There's lots of cells working together. Each of these little dots is a cell, and they're all working together to keep whatever organism this is alive. Now, a way to remember unicellular and multicellular is to look at what the words are made of. Uni comes from well, it means one, essentially, like a unicorn has one horn, or e pluribus unum, out of many, one, if you look at the Latin there. And then cellular has to do with cell, so it means one cell, quite literally. So uni, one, and then cellular, cell. And multi means multiple cells. We can kind of see that one a little more easy, perhaps. Yeah, so unicellular and multicellular. Yes, there are plenty of organisms out there that are only one cell, like the paramecium or the amoeba or anything else. Especially if you look in water, you can see lots of single-celled organisms. Bacteria is another example. Okay, now, this lesson is just a very, very broad overview of like an introduction to cells. So there's a lot more that could be said on the last slide, but we're going to keep going on for now. From here on out, we're going to be talking a little more about the history of how people came to discover that living things are made of cells. And that is going to be through using a tool called a microscope. And as you probably know, a microscope makes things look bigger. So you can see things that you normally wouldn't be able to see with just your eyes by using a microscope. And I think our next section is actually going to be just on microscopes, and so we can talk more about how they work then. But what you need to know for now is that microscopes enable people to see things that are tiny that you wouldn't normally be able to see. So, in the 1660s, there's a scientist named Robert Hooke, and he was looking at all sorts of stuff under a microscope. And he was looking at corkwood in particular one day, and corkwood is like a layer of the bark of a plant. So it's not like exactly the same thing as the cork in a bottle, although they're related, but it's a layer of the bark in a plant. And he discovered these little like compartments that he named cells. And you can actually see one of his original drawings down in the bottom right of this slide. Here's what he observed. And you can actually kind of see where he was looking on this picture of a plant here. But he looked under a microscope and he saw these little compartments, and he thought, oh, that's interesting. And he named them cells because they looked like they were just like these empty cells, like imagine like a prison cell, just a little empty space. And actually the cells he was looking at were dead, so they weren't filled with anything, which made them look empty, of course. But cells are not, in fact, empty. There's a whole lot going on inside of cells. Right around the same time, in the 1670s, there's this guy named Anton van Leeuwenhoek. Interestingly enough, they both have like hook in their name, spelled differently. He was looking at pond water under a microscope, a microscope that was much more powerful than Robert Hooke's, actually. And he saw living unicellular organisms. Remember, unicellular means single-cell organisms. And like I said, in pond water, there's a lot of stuff that you can see going on. And he thought, oh, well, that's interesting, seeing all of these living things. So, people went on to study these cells, this new idea, and we came up with something called cell theory. Now, in science, a theory is kind of a very broad, what's accepted to be truth, and it applies to a lot of things. So it applies to a lot of different areas, and it can explain lots of different phenomena that we see. So there's like the theory of gravity, or a cell theory. And there's also a controversial theory out there as well, the theory of evolution. And I won't go into it a whole lot right now, but I do think that the theory of evolution probably ought not to be talked about as a theory in the sense that it is a true thing that explains a lot. But we can get into that another time. There's credible points and things that are not credible. But anyways, theories tend to be supported by lots of experiments and evidence, and they explain a lot of different things. They're kind of foundational truths for the sciences. And in life science, in the study of biology, cell theory is one of those foundational truths. And there are 3 points that we're going to be talking about here. So it's like a 3-part theory. Every living thing is made of one or more cells. So this would include a banana, it would include an ant, it would include me, a mushroom, the mold that grows on your bread. Every living thing is made of one or more cells. Now, interestingly enough, viruses are not made of cells, and there's kind of a debate as to whether they're actually living or not, but usually people would say the viruses are not living because they're not made of cells. Interesting side note right there. Second point of cell theory is that cells carry out the functions needed for life. So everything's made of cells, and cells are what kind of do all the action of life. So When you are looking with your eyes, it is cells that are controlling the movements of your eyes and picking up the light signals and transmitting the signals to your brain. And so your cells are what are carrying out all of these functions that life needs. The third part of cell theory is that cells only come from other cells. And you can see I have a little animation. Actually, it's not an animation, it's a video of cells. The way that they actually make more cells is they do what's called, they divide. And they can go by several different names depending on what kind of organism. It could be binary fission or mitosis, which we'll learn about later. And so you actually start with one cell, and when it needs to make more cells, it actually just pinches itself in half, and then you have two. And then those will grow, and then they'll pinch themselves in half, and then you get four. So cell division is how the cells come from other cells. And what I think is very interesting about this third point is it leaves you with a question, like, where did cells come from then? So if cells only come from other cells, so like the cells in my body came from other cells, which came from other cells, which came from other cells, and we're several generations back with my great-great-grandparents, at some point you have to have like a first living thing, and where did its cells come from? And so I think that's kind of a fun question that stumps a lot of scientists, really. Scientists don't really have a very good explanation as to where cells came from. They say there's just a soup and it happened to spring forth life. But, of course, being a Christian, I believe that God created life, and that's a marvelously more simple and more beautiful answer than theirs. And it makes more sense. But anyways, without getting too much into that right now, I'll have to restrain myself. These are the three parts of cell theory. And on these 3 points, we can hang all sorts of other truths and all sorts of other observations and experiments, and really it's going to be the foundation for much of what we're going to do in this textbook. So, I'm going to teach you about one more famous scientist, Louis Pasteur. Now, Louis Pasteur lived in the 1800s, and he is a very famous scientist, and he studied some single-cell organisms. So, there are several just points I want you to know about this guy, because he's such an important scientist. One thing is that he discovered why milk goes bad. He was looking at spoiled milk under the microscope, and he realized that there's all these little single-celled organisms, bacteria, in fact, that were in spoiled milk. And so he started to think, oh, maybe they're what is making it go bad. You get all these little living things in there, and that's not, good. And here's where you actually might recognize this term, and it comes from his name, pasteurization. He developed this process where you kind of boil milk to kill all the microorganisms that are living in the milk, and all of a sudden there's not as much to spoil the milk, and so the milk will actually last longer. And so lots of the milk that we have today even is pasteurized. You pasteurize things, and you have a longer life of that product then. So Louis Pasteur's work is affecting you whether you know it or not. Third thing about Louis Pasteur is he discovered what are called germs. He realized that there were these microorganisms, these single-celled things that were making people sick. And this led to the whole germ theory, where people don't just get sick because of bad air or whatever other theory they would have used to explain that back then. There's actually microorganisms that cause people to get sick. And this should be pretty familiar to us, not only because we're in a pandemic, but because we're told throughout all our life to wash our hands and to avoid germs and all of that. So it seems like second nature to us to know that germs are what cause people to get sick. But back then, I mean, there's no reason that you would think that there's tiny living things that are making you sick. That'd be kind of almost sound science fiction-ish. But in fact, with science, we have found out that that is what a lot of illness is caused by, is germs. The fourth point on Louis Pasteur is that he disproved this idea of spontaneous generation. Now let's talk about that term, spontaneous generation. That's the belief that living things can just kind of poof up out of nothing. And so scientists would see bacteria starting to, form in, say, some spoiled food or in water or whatever, and they might think, oh, these are just kind of popping up out of nowhere, or like the water's producing the germs. So people used to think that you could get life just kind of spontaneously generating out of things. So spontaneous means just kind of random, like spontaneity. It just happens. And generation means production, like something new is generated. So spontaneous generation of life is life just kind of coming out of whatever, spontaneously. And his experiment that he used to disprove that involved 2 flasks of broth. Now, this broth, I have a diagram of the experiment here, is basically like superfood for bacteria. You could think of it that way. It's something that would naturally spoil very easily. And I think the little bacteria would love to live in there and grow and reproduce. It makes them happy. So what he did is he had 2 flasks, and he boiled both of them. So when you boil the flask, you're killing any living thing that could potentially be in there. So with a flask that he actually kept closed, so he sealed the flask after boiling it, in this example number 1 here, he boiled the flask, killing everything in it, and then you wait, and nothing grows in it. You could keep it for years and years on the shelf, and nothing would grow in it. And he had that flask closed, so nothing can get through this little tube here. It's kind of pinched closed at the end. But then in another flask, he would boil it, and then he would break the neck off the flask. So he would open it up and expose it to the air. And then suddenly you get this microbial growth. And microbial just means microorganisms are growing in there. So bacteria are growing in there. And it would kind of get all nasty and spoiled. And so this experiment disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. Because spontaneous generation would say that you could have a flask of just broth, and even if you keep it completely isolated from everything else, it will spontaneously produce its own bacteria. But this experiment showed that that didn't happen in example number 1 here, where the flask was boiled and nothing grew. But in number 2, the second flask, when you expose it to the air, you're getting this growth. So that would lead you to think that there's something in the air that is getting into the broth and causing it to spoil. And that would be germs or bacteria, microorganisms that are floating around. It could be mold even, and lots of different things that are floating around in the air. Yeah, so this is Louis Pasteur's experiment, just proving spontaneous generation. Alright, so that is the end of the notes that I have for you right now. I hope that you took some good notes on that, and feel free to go through and look in your book as well. It should cover just about all the same topics that I just covered. So just to review, cells are the basic unit of life, and life needs several things. It needs energy and materials and living space. Those are the 3 needs of life. And the characteristics of a living thing is they have organization, they have the ability to grow and develop, they respond to the environment, and they are able to reproduce and make more of themselves. And also you could add in there that they are made of cells. Unicellular organisms are made of 1 cell, multicellular are made of multiple cells. Robert Hooke discovered cells looking at cork bark using a microscope in the 1660s. And then, what was his name? Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He discovered living single-celled organisms in pond water. Then we learned about cell theory, where every living thing is made of 1 or more cells. Cells carry out the functions needed to support life, and cells can only come from other living cells. And we also talked about Louis Pasteur and his experiments with germs and bacteria and spontaneous generation. So that's just a quick summary of the section's notes for you. Alright, well, I hope that you enjoyed this lesson, and I'll see you next time. Take care.